So, Nick, you recently authored a report around brands in higher education, brands in universities particularly, and that takes a particular point of view. Could you first of all just tell us a bit more about the nature of the report? Who is it?
Sure. So the report was about, I guess the starting point for us was the Firehaus belief that universities should be the most exciting brands in the world, and that in some cases they struggle to be that. Outside of the sector, you get brands with relatively boring products who have great brands and are able to kind of tell their stories in a really interesting, exciting narrative way. And then within HE, you have these fantastic institutions that have got loads of really exciting, interesting stories, and yet they don't manifest as exciting brands. And it seems kind of relatively self-evident from the outside, but obviously when you are confronted with that, it gets difficult to understand why, because we know and work with lots of people in HE, and they're all very smart people, very committed to their job, and they know what they're talking about. So what are the barriers that are getting in the way of these brands becoming exciting? And so hence we wanted to understand that. We wanted to get under the skin of it, hence the report. And it's been great to hear from, I think we've got about 125 responses, higher ed. Most of them admittedly are from the UK, but we've got a couple of international voices in there from Germany, America, and a couple of other places. So it's their voice. They're not suppliers, it's not partners, it's all people within HE institutions. And it's great to see, that everybody in HE does know what they're talking about. They do know, they do know what they need, and there are some kind of systemic things that are getting in the way of them achieving that. But it's not the people at the heart of it.
Interesting, thank you. And so reading the report, I was, there was some really interesting, in light of what you've just said about, marketing communications in HE and in universities, there's some really interesting stats in there, I thought, and just some interesting data. And it raises some interesting questions, doesn't it? And I thought the one, as I was reading through it, perhaps a good starting point is 13% of participants reported having audience segmentation in place.
Yeah.
Which a lot of brands would consider really, really fundamental. And only 22% described their planning as robust and audience-led. And it sounds like that would have some really significant implications for institutions beyond branding as well as for branding. And I just wondered, could you talk to that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a really interesting point. And as you rightly point out, that's got massive implications, right? Because when we deal with brands, the most common thing, and this is in any category, not just higher ed, is to think of brands as like, what do I want people to say about me? So let's talk about our brand. When people hear about us, they need to, understand that we're vibrant and we're inclusive and we're this and we're that and we're whatever. But that isn't where brand can have the greatest effect. Brand can have the greatest effect when instead of that evaluation point, it's salience, right? It's out in the minds of people. They've got a problem. And when that problem comes to mind, or the solution to that problem rather comes to mind, the brand is thought of. So if it's Coke, I'm thirsty on a hot day, I think of a Coke. If it's university, I want a university that gives me great career outcomes, or whatever. I want to, study with the professor of quantum or something. So the act of the brand is to get out into those minds, right? It's not about only understanding yourself as an institution. It's about understanding the minds of the people you're trying to lodge the brand in. And therefore, if you don't understand their minds, you can't do that, right? So I think universities are really, really good at understanding big chunks of their audiences, right? And in some respects, that's a step forward in that brand thing, because universities understand students, and there's no denying that. And on all the projects we've worked on, we're always getting reports of, the hierarchy of this is most important, etc., etc. What the data is telling us in the report is really interesting, is that they don't tend to get then down to the next level, which is kind of the different groups of students. And I've seen that. I've been to quite a few HE conferences where, they talk about, like, China is not a student, or India is not a student, or in some cases, international is not a student, but it quite often gets kind of bundled up to that level, at least at to a market level. And if you obviously think about the huge numbers of people in those segments, it's just unworkable as a broad group. So I think that there's the kind of the beginnings of it is, yeah, we do think about our audience, but they don't break it down. And that's what we saw in the data and in the interviews that came afterwards. The kind of rationale was along the lines of, it's just so big and we don't have, you know, the resources to kind of subdivide it. I think from my perspective, what's a really interesting build on that is the best types of segmentation, particularly at brand level, are market segmentations or category segmentations, right? You don't segment your own customer base unless you're doing cold email or whatever, you know, very direct mail type stuff. You segment the market and then you work out where you want to play in it. And I think there's a big opportunity in HE for people to segment the market. Everyone agree these are the kind of core way of talking about people, and then everybody can still work within that scope. But it's something that could be solved en masse rather than every institution has to solve it individually.
Oh, that's a really, really interesting point. So there could be a shared kind of collaborative pool of learning, which is interesting in the context of the recent post-16 education and skills white paper, isn't it, which calls upon education providers, both FE and HE, to collaborate more effectively, to work together, to develop the skills of kind of people coming through the system. So you know, ideally, like collaborating on that sort of data could be a really good thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it might already exist and we just don't know about it, but I think we don't know about it as consultants in the space. But then obviously the individuals who are filling in our survey and saying we don't have access to this, we don't use it, aren't using it either, and don't have access to it. HE's got a really interesting history of different universities banding together for shared services and things like that. Massive opportunity to create that segmentation amongst a group, and everyone gets stuck into it and use it
and see it as another kind of shared service in a way.
I don't see why not. Exactly.
Interesting. And I suppose building off that, and I wonder if this is connected, is 67% of respondents felt that marketing being seen as the owners of the brand was a barrier to what they were trying to achieve. And you might consider that surprising because you know, people might go, well, oh, you know, if brand isn't the property of marketing, well, whose responsibility is it? Or you know, and I think it's interesting that it was described as a barrier, and I suppose why was that? And I suppose what are the implications of that? Because it's an interesting response.
Yeah. It's really interesting, and I think it shows a good level of strategic maturity by the people that are filling in the survey to recognize that as a barrier. I think it seems, you know, we're kind of taught as marketing people that lots of categories share very similar characteristics, right? But I think that there are some key differences for higher ed. Higher ed, to me, is something that is advertising is a really weak force, right? Communications are a really weak force in higher ed. That's not because they're not doing a good job. It's just the spend of it versus the fact that as a minimum you spend 3 years as a student, and therefore your experience is far going to outweigh what you saw on a couple of Facebook or Instagram posts or whatever. So although marketing has an impact on how the brand is perceived and whatever, in higher ed it's got a limited impact, and instead all those other things that add up to your experience of a particular institution make a much stronger, have a bigger effect. That is almost opposite to the case in a lot of FMCG things. Obviously there is customer experience and there is product experience, but if it's whatever, you know, washing detergent or something like that, most of that is very low conscious processing type stuff. I'm just using this stuff. What I'm forming my opinions on is the way the brand is presented to me and the advertising, you know, the famous thing about beer and drinking the label and all that. I don't think that applies in higher ed, or it only applies in a very weak way. So if you have a system where everyone believes that marketing are really the only people that are having that much effect on brand, yet marketing can only have a relatively limited effect on how the brand is perceived, you've got a recipe for trouble. And I think the survey shows that people recognize that, but are struggling to get that message heard further in their institution.
I mean, that is interesting, because just coming back to the sort of first point you made about when you were talking about the report and this notion of exciting brands, and I guess just it kind of raises the point about what an HE brand is compared to a product brand or any other brand. And I think our experience has been that understanding of the concept of brand, well, firstly, brands vary, and that concept perhaps that is understood in institutions in a particular way outside of marketing potentially. What would you say to that?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, and it's, I mean, obviously you could talk for hours, right, about the semantics of brand, couldn't you? And or probably do a PhD in it or something like that. But yes, you're absolutely right. I think there's that sense. As soon as you mention the word brand, people think of logos and color schemes and fonts, and then from that, when people talk about being on brand, it's like, well, have you used the right color, or have you put the logo in the top right, or whatever? And actually, those in marketing, and I think that came through loud and clear, those that responded to the survey and we interviewed, they don't think of brand like that. They understand that brand is bigger, right? Brand is this intended set of, this intention of perception of your institution. But I guess, yes, there's, as soon as you mention that word outside of marketing, as you reference, it kind of gets, oh, it's just in a box with colors and things like that. And it's really interesting because, as you well know, reputation and brand can mean the same thing, or could mean slightly different things, and they get different respect levels with difference. And I think there's we're kind of on the fence of it, whether you champion brand outside of marketing and make a case for it or persuade it, or whether the right thing to do is to go, well, actually, have you thought about your positioning? Have you thought about differentiation when you're talking to VC and senior leadership or whatever? And don't mention the brand word, because that might get buy-in. And we didn't really explore that with the survey respondents, but it's probably something worth pursuing.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to know what they think, and whether in the first instance you need a sort of proxy for the value of the thinking and the role it plays in the institution, possibly in strategic planning or something, as opposed to being seen as something sort of way downstream in a communications touch point, like, I don't know, X or something, which I'm sure, to a lot of people in the university feels like it's something very superficial.
Yes.
Even if it still has an important role to play within that, connected system or whatever. And I suppose coming on to that, really, and I was sort of intrigued by this as well, that only 23% of participants claim their leadership was engaged with the brand. And why does that matter?
Well, yeah, I mean, that it's really interesting. What we don't have in the data is the name of the universities from the respondents, and I think that would be a really interesting one, because in my, and I know your experience as part of Firehaus, there are university leadership teams who really prioritize the brand or the reputation and building it and understand it, even if they're from an academic background or whatever. And there are university leadership teams that don't. And it seems to be that depending where you are in the broad rankings can have quite an impact on which of those two camps you fall into, right? And this is when you get into reputation and brand and things like that. And I think there's a subset of universities who have really had to fight for some time now, for students and for funding and whatever, and it has been a battle. And they have learned that brand is a weapon that can be deployed in that battle, if we can stretch the metaphor. And the VCs get it because they've seen it applied, and then they've seen the numbers come up or the funding change or whatever. And there are then those institutions that are so massive and their reputation is so big, their equity is so big, that brand changes can take a lot longer to filter through. And I think that means that senior leadership are therefore not getting the sense that if I tweak this here, I see this outcome here. It's not as immediate, and therefore it's harder to wrap your head around. And if you then add to that this sense of maybe an academic background or something that isn't marketing, and a suspicion of brand generally, then you're not going to get buy-in. However, getting back to your actual question, the why it's important is without that leadership buy-in, it's not going to be a reality, right? Because it has to be embedded in all the strategy, embedded in all the decision making, embedded in the behavior of an institution. And even though universities are very broad churches, they do take guidance from their leadership, right? And if the leadership don't prioritize a particular thing, the rest of the institution won't prioritize that particular thing. And you can very swiftly, you can write all the PowerPoint decks you want about where we want to be, what I want my target to be. But if leadership isn't reinforcing that and embodying that, everyone else has got a get out of jail free card. Well, I don't need to do it because they're not doing it, and it all falls apart.
Okay. And presumably if that leadership buy-in isn't there as well, is that, we know, don't we, that brand management over time is hugely important. So, even if you do a great job of understanding how you're positioned, and you understand the various audiences, and you've got that real insight into them, and then you have, however you then choose to express that, however it might manifest or shape your institution. I think, whether it's it makes you reappraise something that you do, or how you do it, or how you reward your people. Brands manifest in lots of different ways at an institutional level, don't they? But presumably it has those implications for that effective brand management, because that can't be effective if you don't have that leadership buy-in, because effectively it would inadvertently form a barrier within the organization.
Yeah,
those sorts of decisions to be influenced by the thing you've decided you stand for.
Yeah, I completely agree. Brand is a strategic choice. Is a strategic tool, right? And as you know, and strategy is all about making choices. And fundamentally, the buck stops with the leadership. They're the ones making the choices, right? So if those three things aren't aligned, if they're not making choices in line with the brand, then no one will. No one will. Yeah.
Right. And then let's think, what else I was sort of reading through. I mean, I suppose coming on to that then and reaching that position, the report shows the majority of participants think differentiation is really important.
Yes.
And I think if you work in brand strategy, that would seem like an absolute no-brainer. But only 15% of the marketers in the report, in the sample, say their institution has a genuinely differentiated position. And I just wonder, because differentiation is if you work in branding, it's an interesting concept now. And I suppose, is brand differentiation the right thing to be aiming for, given universities actually do very similar things sometimes? So is that possible?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, and one I'm not sure we have a kind of definitive answer to, right? Which is the challenge. First off, I think it's really wherever you go with the terminology and what is possible and what isn't possible, etc. I think from a brand strategy perspective, it's always good to be pursuing that line of thought, right? So whether or not you think it's fundamentally doomed to failure in the end, you should be trying to get as close to a level of differentiation as possible, even if you might not perfectly achieve it, because you can certainly narrow the field from everybody to people like us, and get smaller and smaller and smaller, and then so you're picking your battles a bit. There's obviously the point, the kind of Byron Sharp stuff around differentiation versus distinctiveness, which is really interesting. And depending on whether you subscribe to that, if you did subscribe to that, it doesn't matter that universities aren't differentiated. What they should be is distinct. What they don't appear to be at the moment is really that distinct beyond, as well as not differentiated. But, they're distinct in that there's only one university, or generally one university per city, or whatever, or two. So they're quite distinct based on their name. But in the way that they present themselves, they don't tend to be so. So there's a massive opportunity, from thinking about it at a brand level, to not be chasing too much after that differentiation, but kind of say, okay, well, we're doing the same thing, but we can talk about it in a very different way to our competitors. We can present it to the world in a very different way to our competitors. So I think the kind of part of me that is a Byron Sharp junkie sits in that world. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that we're not differentiated. Let's just find what's important and present it in a different way. So when people see it, they know it's us and they know it's not anyone else. That said, I think the recent, post-16 white paper is really interesting, and I haven't finished reading it, so I don't want to be misquoting or whatever. But my understanding, at least, is the kind of the importance of differentiation in the market, and this idea that universities may become more known for certain things and less known for others. And so that seemed to me like a kind of outward pressure forcing a bit of differentiation on the market. And so that's going to be really interesting to see how that plays out, because what we may end up with, the way you framed it as, actually universities fundamentally do the same thing. They might fundamentally do the same thing in 10 years' time, but they might be doing it on a bespoke set of subjects, right? For obviously, there's going to be some overlap. So maybe the market will become more differentiated, in which case that's something that you can lean into. I think, the brand thinking, brand strategy enables you to leverage existing differentiations or give you guidance on where you should differentiate. But fundamentally, if you want differentiation, you've got to have, as you know, a different product. And if that product is a research strength or a facility or whatever, you need that to be able to leverage it in the market.
Yeah. And then also kind of, I guess, coming back full circle to that point about audience insight, it's got to be meaningful as well, because it doesn't matter if it's just different or distinct. It's actually got to be something that your audiences, whether they're funders, alumni, students, civic partners, they've got to be meaningful to those people as well.
Absolutely.
You've got this great thing, because sadly people might not want it. Yeah,
that's right. And I think that's a really interesting part of it, because I think that people sometimes chase after differentiation so much and chase after that meaning so much that they end up kind of inventing a meaningful thing about we're the university of empathy or whatever like that, and then we're going to differentiate by being the university of empathy, and that's a really, really hard thing to prove and to be real and whatever. So I think that there is a school of thought that you just keep digging until you find something that's different, and it's certainly worth trying that in the first instance. But if you can't find it, let's go, okay, fine, we are another university in this thing, let's just make it appear different. And then I think, and the Byron Sharp view, it meaningless distinction, right? You can be the green university that talks about this and does it this way, and then it's just you're saying similar things to everyone else, but it's getting lodged against you much better because it's so much more recognizable.
Yeah, although that also presents its own challenges eventually, doesn't it? So
I knew you would say that.
Think through all these things.
Yes.
But I think, having read the whole white paper, I think there is something you're alluding to, which is the point around specialization, and I think there's an interesting question there, isn't there, around about how do you specialize. And I'm sure HE leaders saw this coming, and it won't be any surprise to them that the government's direction of travel, and the desire for it to support their plan for change and things like that. But nonetheless, a lot of the thinking and research and understanding we're talking about would be very useful in the context of how you make those decisions. It can't help you make that decision in its entirety, but not having that understanding of your landscape, your audience, how you may then position whatever you think you're going to be in the future relative to anybody else. And it's interesting in the white paper, actually, the government actually talk about competitive advantage in the context of HE, which is really interesting. That they're reducing that language, I think possibly quite challenging.
Yes.
Is interesting, isn't it? I suppose.
Yeah, definitely.
Anyway, we should probably sort of start to bring this to a close, but I think I just had one slightly interesting thing I wanted to put to you, which really leapt off the page to me and slightly amused me, but it was a really sort of interesting quote, because one participant in their responses described brand as a meaningless concept used by central marketing teams to spend money when a new director wants to add a rebrand to their CV. What would you say in response to that?
Well, I mean, I think there's probably a truth buried in there. So I think if you kind of split that into two things, is it a meaningless concept, and do rebrands happen more often than they should? And I think the answer to the first is no, and the answer to the second is probably. The first bit, this is going to show my kind of cultural level. I think there's an Arnold Schwarzenegger film where he goes up against the devil, right? Bear with me. And I think there's like, imagine this like delivered in an Arnie way, but it's something like, you know, you might not believe in the devil, but the devil certainly believes in you, or something like that. And I kind of think of that about the brand thing, which is like, you can think it's a meaningless concept, but it is a useful frame and a useful way of looking at things, right? And any academic or anyone, you know, who's kind of interested in ideas knows that most models are wrong, right? It's always an oversimplification of whatever it is you're trying to think about. And brand approach is possibly wrong in some respects, but what it's enabling you to do is think about it in a certain way. And that's a really, really important way of thinking about it. If you think about your challenges with a brand lens on, and you come to exactly the same conclusions that you came to before, fine, great, good. Stop thinking about brand, whatever. I would just argue that means you've just, you know, you've already ended up in the right place, but whatever. But it's just a way of thinking about things and an approach. And frankly, I mean, I'm satisfied that there's enough academic and commercial evidence that it works and is a thing, right? There's no way that all these corporates and whatever would be sinking billions of dollars a year into this stuff if they didn't have evidence it worked. The second point, though, I think is an interesting point, which is that how often rebrands happen, and it happens outside of HE. It does appear to happen in HE that sometimes it's a bit of a knee-jerk reaction to a problem, whereas brands are built over time, and you don't probably need to rebrand every 3 years or something like that. And yeah, maybe I don't know whether it is new marketing directors or whatever, but you know, I think you need to think carefully about whether you need a rebrand. There's usually the kind of nugget of the brand that still exists that hasn't been fully leveraged in a lot of cases. And that's a better place to start than just kind of throwing it all out and starting again. But, you know, different places have different challenges. There certainly are some institutions that have things they need to change.
Yeah. I thought it also revealed an interesting experience of brand, which it is rebranding. It's like that look and feel stuff, as opposed to some of the stuff we've really been talking about today, which is around the strategic part of branding, which is actually, you know, not uniquely the province of corporates or the private sector. It's actually just it's as relevant for a not-for-profit institution as it is for a for-profit organization, isn't it, in the end? Because it's as much about how you understand what, you know, you're trying to achieve and how you prioritize objectives and how you know, all of the things we've been talking about have the same relevance. It's just wrapped up in a difficult word sometimes.
Absolutely.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.